In 1862, a single day of battle left more than 23,000 men dead or wounded in just a few hours. It became the bloodiest day in the history of the United States. Entire fields were covered with bodies, towns turned into improvised hospitals, and families across the country received news that would change their lives forever. But that massacre was only a small part of something much larger. It was just one moment in a conflict so violent that it nearly destroyed the United States itself. A war where Americans fought Americans, where brothers stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, and where the future of the nation was truly at stake. But before we continue, if you enjoy learning how historical events shaped the world we live in today, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps the channel continue bringing stories like this. The American Civil War did not begin overnight. In reality, it had been building for decades as the United States expanded rapidly across the North American continent. The country was growing in territory, population, and economic power. But while the nation expanded and prospered, a deep contradiction was growing alongside it, one that had existed since the very founding of the country. When the United States declared independence in 1776, its leaders spoke about liberty, equality, and the rights of individuals. These ideas became the foundation of American identity and inspired political movements around the world. But the reality was far more complicated. Millions of people were still living in slavery inside a nation that claimed to stand for freedom. By the middle of the 19th century, that contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. The country had effectively split into two very different societies. In the North, cities were growing rapidly and the economy was becoming increasingly industrial. Factories were being built, railroads connected distant regions, and commerce was expanding quickly. In the South, however, the economy remained largely agricultural, centered mainly on the production of cotton. Massive plantations dominated the landscape, and enslaved labor was considered essential to keeping that economic system running. These differences created two societies with completely different visions of the nation's future. While many in the North believed slavery should gradually disappear, Southern states viewed the institution as fundamental to their economy and their way of life. The problem became even more complicated as the United States continued expanding westward. Every time a new territory was added to the country, the same question immediately emerged. Would the new territory allow slavery, or would it become a free state? This question had enormous political consequences. Every new state meant more representation in the United States Congress, and whoever controlled Congress would ultimately control the direction of the country. For years, political leaders attempted to prevent the conflict from exploding. Compromises were created to maintain a delicate balance between free states and slave states. But those agreements only delayed the problem. The tension continued to build. By the 1850s, the situation was beginning to spiral out of control. In the Kansas Territory, groups that supported slavery and those who opposed it began moving into the region in order to influence the political future of the territory. The result was a series of violent clashes that turned the region into a battleground. This period became known as Bleeding Kansas. Not long after, another dramatic event shook the country. An abolitionist named John Brown led an attack on a federal arsenal in the town of Harper's Ferry. His goal was to trigger a large-scale slave uprising that would spread across the South. The plan failed, and Brown was eventually captured and executed. But the impact of the event was enormous. For many in the South, it seemed like proof that their enemies were willing to use violence to destroy the slave system. Political tensions continued to rise, and soon another event would completely change the course of American history. In 1860, the United States elected a new president. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Although he did not initially advocate abolishing slavery where it already existed, his election was seen by many Southern leaders as a direct threat to their future. The reaction was swift. Even before Lincoln officially took office, several Southern states decided to leave the United States altogether. South Carolina became the first state to declare its secession from the Union. Soon after, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. Together, they formed a new country known as the Confederate States of America. The United States was now divided, but the war had not yet begun. The conflict finally erupted in April of 1861, when Confederate forces opened fire on a Union military fortress located in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. The fort was known as Fort Sumter. That bombardment marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. At first, many people believed the conflict would not last long. Some assumed that only a few battles would be necessary to settle the situation. But reality would prove very different. The war quickly turned into a massive conflict involving millions of soldiers and some of the most violent battles the country had ever seen. Many of the soldiers who enlisted early in the war believed they were joining a short and glorious campaign. But once the first major battles took place, it became clear that this war would be far more brutal than anything the United States had experienced before. The weapons of the era were far more lethal than those used in earlier conflicts. Rifles were more accurate, artillery was more destructive, and yet many armies still relied on outdated tactics. Soldiers often marched across open fields directly toward enemy fire. The results were devastating. In 1862, the Battle of Antietam became the bloodiest single day in American military history. In just one day, more than 23,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. The following year, another battle would completely change the direction of the war. In July of 1863, Union and Confederate armies collided in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, tens of thousands of soldiers fought in a brutal confrontation. When the battle finally ended, more than 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, or missing. The Confederate defeat at Gettysburg became a decisive turning point in the war. At the same time, Union forces in the Western Theater achieved another critical victory by capturing the city of Vicksburg and taking control of the Mississippi River. This effectively split the Confederate territory in two and severely weakened the South. Over the following years, the North's advantages in industry, infrastructure, and population began to make an enormous difference. Confederate forces fought fiercely, but they struggled increasingly to replace soldiers and maintain their supplies. Finally, in April of 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in the small town of Appomattox Courthouse. After 4 years of devastating war, the conflict had finally come to an end. More than 600,000 Americans had lost their lives. Slavery was officially abolished in the United States, and the country entered a long and difficult period of reconstruction. But even after the war ended, one final tragedy was about to unfold. Only 5 days after the Confederate surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Washington. The man who had guided the country through its darkest moment would never live to see the rebuilding of the nation he helped save. The American Civil War nearly destroyed the United States, but it also redefined the nation and set the stage for the country's rise in the decades that followed. And if you want to continue following this story and understand how the United States eventually became a global superpower, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes.